Hello, it's Andrea Dunlop, and today on Nobody Should Believe Me, we have a very special episode that is a full circle moment for me and the show, my conversation with Gypsy Rose Blanchard. It seems unlikely that anyone listening would be unfamiliar with Gypsy's story, but as a refresher, Gypsy Rose Blanchard is an American woman who, after suffering lifelong Munchausen by proxy abuse, conspired with her online boyfriend, Nicholas Godejohn, to kill her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, in June of 2015. Gypsy pled guilty to second-degree murder in 2016 and received a 10-year prison sentence. She was paroled on December 28, 2023, after serving about 8 years. Gypsy and her story have been the subject of major media attention, including documentaries, dramatizations, a reality show, and extensive tabloid coverage. And we're going to talk about all of that today. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Well, first of all, I wanted to have you introduce yourself to listeners using the context that you would like. So who are you according to Gypsy?
So who am I? My name is Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and I am an author, and I am a mother, a proud mother.
I love that. So, Gypsy, we had an interesting sort of circuitous route to one another. Obviously, when you were released from prison, is it 2 years ago now?
2 years, yeah.
Yeah, that was a big news story. Obviously, I have the only podcast that I know of that covers Munchausen by proxy cases pretty exclusively to this point. So obviously, a lot of people asked me about interviewing you. And I said to folks who asked me that question at the time, I'd be much more interested in talking to her a couple of years from now. And here we are. So it feels really fortuitous, and I'm really happy that you reached out. So we originally actually met each other because your producers of your Lifetime series reached out to me and taped a conversation where you asked me some questions. And so I was really happy to connect with you in that context. That was when your baby was brand new. I remember seeing her on the screen there. And then you reached out to me more recently, and so thank you so much for coming on. And my first question for you is just, how are you doing? What's your life all about right now?
My life right now is all about motherhood, and there's really little time for anything else. So I spend my days doing the whole housework mom thing that seems to take up all of my time. I have few hobbies, but the things that my life is about right now is healing and learning how to navigate a life that is post prison, but also like post the surge of media attention after getting released.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say you've had a pretty unique set of life experiences. Growing up in an abusive home where you were extremely isolated, being in prison, which is another sort of set of very different social circumstances, I would assume, from the outside world. And then going into this period of your life where you were out of prison and you had this massive surge of media attention and online fame/infamy, whichever way you would characterize it. And now, do you feel like you're in kind of a new chapter, or has that sort of attention on you persisted? I am wondering, like, sort of how that is now.
I think it has lessened over time. There was that initial surge of people posting about me and media attention and everything. And now that we're, 2 years post all that, there is still attention. It is not as much as it was in the beginning. But at least it's enough to where, like, it's died down enough to where I can go to the grocery store and only be recognized like once.
That must just be incredibly intense. And I think, I think a lot about sort of what your relationship with social media must be like, because, can you remind me how, and I know this is sort of part of your story, but how old are you, chronologically speaking?
I'm 34.
Okay, you're 34. Yeah. So, these technologies were around when you were younger. I'm 43, so like I really was like the last age of person to like grow up without social media, and like I didn't have a cell phone until after
Mhm.
college. But so obviously some of those technologies were around when you were growing up, but
Mhm.
obviously you were growing up in very
Yeah.
specific set of circumstances. And then, I
Mhm.
assume those things were not available to you, the way they are on the outside when you were in prison.
Facebook was a thing. TikTok was not. TikTok had came in to the picture almost at the middle to tail end of my prison sentence. So that was not something that I knew navigating before I got locked up.
And what kind of, when you were in prison, what kind of sort of technologies and communications were available to you while you were in prison?
Very, very limited. We had personal tablets assigned to us that through the course of my prison sentence, we were able to get more and more apps over time. Particularly, we were excited about the phone app. So we were allowed to call our family on the tablet after so long. And we were able to have like little games and stuff like that, but it was not internet accessible.
Right. So you didn't have kind of unfettered access to social media accounts and that kind of thing. So, then you come out of prison and then you immediately develop this just massive social media following, millions and millions of people. And, that would be jarring, I think, for someone in any set of circumstances. Frankly, I think the experience of going viral, I think can be downright traumatic under the best of circumstances. And this was obviously not the best of circumstances. So I wonder kind of like, yeah, how you've navigated that piece, because, I was listening to an interview with you. You're talking about that you had something like 8 million followers on Instagram and
Yeah.
then deleted that account, which I think for people who are, the large number of people that are pretty obsessed with building that kind of following or anything, even sort of a percentage of that kind of following, just sort of it feels almost, it just is inconceivable, right? So yeah, so talk to us about that kind of that decision and just some of the decisions that you've made around social media and how you've navigated that, because that's just the most intense experience I can imagine on social media.
It is. So before I got out of prison, I had asked my then husband, now ex-husband, to create social media for me. So Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. So he had made these accounts for me. So when I would get out, I would have access to them and already built a small following. So I think right before I got out, I had like maybe 500 followers, and then overnight it went into the millions. Like we just kept watching it climb and climb and climb, and it was wild. And so for me, social media was something fun. Like it was something that I got to do TikTok dances and little cute clothing hauls and stuff like this. But there was also such a call to action for me to treat it more seriously as a platform to advocate. And so here I am, fresh out of prison, don't even have my own feet on the ground, and people are like, you need to advocate. You need to be basically what you are in a night. Um, and that was a lot of pressure on me. And then mix that with, of course, the internet's going to do what the internet's going to do. They're going to build you up and tear you down. So after so many months, I started to see people trying to tear me down. And in the mix of all that, I was also on parole. And so my parole officer had told me that it would probably be in my best interest if I would just stay off social media. It wasn't a direct order, it was a suggestion. And so that's when I deleted the 9 million follower Instagram, but maintained the, 9 million, 10 million TikTok account. And so that's what kind of sparked that decision, was just because I was tired of all the harassing phone calls that people were making to my parole officer, falsely reporting me for anything and everything. So it's kind of like I have had a love-hate relationship with social media. There's so many people that do support me, and then there's also so many people that are part of the anti-gyp community. There is two different communities, which is it's wild. I say they are just as extreme as those who follow politics. You have your pro-gypsy and your anti-gypsy, and they butt heads, they go to war. It is a serious thing. Like, it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you're talking about that sort of intense pressure for you, because watching from the outside, I just thought this young woman has been through so much. They have not had time to heal, develop coping mechanisms, all of those things that really, I had to do before I was ready to talk about anything that I'd been through publicly. And there are like many, many important distinctions between, your experience and mine, namely being that I'm not a survivor of childhood trauma, and that is different. I was older when I made the decision to talk publicly, and it had been a long time since those events actually sort of happened in my life, and I'd had a lot of time to process. And something I've thought about a lot as, I've interviewed various survivors, and as I've talked to people who are considering telling their story publicly, whether they're a family member or a direct survivor of the abuse, is like trying to help them make sure that they're ready for that, because people are going to have opinions. You cannot control. I always try and tell people, like, I can make editorial choices about how we tell the story and what to include, but I cannot control how people react. That's just not something that's under my control. And that experience, even on the much, smaller level of being on my show, which it's, we're big for a podcast, but we're not talking about, 9 million sort of, and like all this huge major media attention that you had. And like, and I'll even talk to people who they really have a good intention around it. They say, I want to share my story because I want to help other people. And I think that's a really noble intention. But the reality is it's not going to go well if that person's not feeling safe and supported in telling that story and feeling like they're really ready. And what I saw with your story was really no one gave you a choice about whether or not you were ready to take on that position of being this monolithic representation of all survivors of Munchausen by proxy, which is not fair.
Exactly. It wasn't something that I was ready to take on at the time, because I'm still even trying to figure out how a Keurig works. I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate streaming, because back in prison and before that, we had cable. Streaming wasn't a thing, or at least it just started to be a thing that we didn't even have. So, coming out, I'm learning how to survive, gain independence. When I first got out, I didn't even know how to drive. So that was something that I was navigating too. So it's like all of these normal things I'm just learning. So it's not like I had a foundation to be like, okay, yeah, I'm ready to tackle on being an advocate right now. Because I'm still trying to heal myself. And a friend of mine had posed a question to me, and I thought about it long and hard. And the fact is that mainstream media, they want the story and to produce the story and put out the story when it's big and it's hot and it's fresh. No one is going to say, okay, I can see that you're not ready. We'll be back in 2-3 years. Whenever you're ready to talk, we'll be here. That's not what they say. That's not how they present it. And so I have kind of thought about choices that I have made, and not necessarily regret, but I feel like I could have done some choices differently for the benefit of my own healing instead of jumping right in.
Yeah. And, as other survivors are thinking about telling their stories publicly, as they're, going on social media and thinking about talking it there, or if they're, doing something that's sort of on a podcast or on a documentary, I mean, what kind of perspective can you offer about the choices that you might have made differently?
I think that if I could have gone back and done things differently, I would have waited to share my story in its entirety until after I've had therapy. Because I started, I'm not saying that I regret writing my memoir. I just kind of feel like the timing of it, I wish I would have gotten intense therapy as I was, or even before writing the manuscript, because there's some things now that I have healed from that I can, maybe elaborate a little differently on, or have hindsight that could have helped me back then. But like I said, I am appreciative of all of the media outlets and the producers that have given me a platform to share my story, because I feel like in a sense that helped a lot of people be aware of Munchausen by proxy. But it is kind of like at the expense of me. So that's something that now, 2 years later of being free, getting out of prison, I am knee deep in therapy. I'm doing the work, and as I'm doing the work, I'm starting to have realizations and understandings more of my feelings, and give myself that grace. Hold myself accountable for the wrong choices that I've made, but give myself slowly self-forgiveness too.
As a person who's in this community, your story absolutely has helped people have some working understanding of Munchausen by proxy and at least know what it is, because that is certainly, these events happened in my own life, within my own family. Back in the early 2010s was when this situation was happening in my family. And there was, that was before the story of your case, and sort of watching that progression of awareness in the public and in the media has been profound. I mean, that's the thing that when I'm having that, strange dinner party conversation of like, what do you do for a living? I decide to answer that question honestly, instead of just being like, oh, I'm a writer and stuff. But when I tell people that, and then the minute I say Munchausen by proxy, I mean, almost everyone is like, oh yeah, the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, right? And obviously that it's fraught because there were, some very sensationalized versions of your story that we can kind of talk about. And I'd love to know kind of how you feel about some of the ways in which your story has been represented and misrepresented. Mm-hmm. And I also know that you didn't choose to be the face of this, and that was not an active choice on your behalf to bring it out of the shadows. And so I just want to recognize that I see where that has come at the cost of your well-being, safety, mental health, and I'm sorry that it had to be that way. And just know that, like, within my community of people, the professionals who've been working on it for decades that I've been so lucky to connect with, the survivors, the people that listen to the show, very much rooting for you.
Thank you.
And so obviously your story has been the subject of, in addition to sort of the tabloid gossip and the sort of, writing about you and every single thing you're doing in your romantic relationships and et cetera, has been and on and on and on, has been the subject of a couple of really, substantive documentaries and dramatization, The Act. And I think it has led to this idea that you personally have somehow cashed in this big way on the events that happened to your life. And I don't think that perception is in line with reality. And you have been involved or not involved in some of these projects directly. Some of these projects happened, to my understanding, without your involvement or even your consent. So right. Can you talk a little bit about how you were involved with some of these projects, and just sort of like what people may not understand about what it is to be a person who is famous in the context of being, the victim and an accessory to a crime?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the documentaries, whether I had participated or not, I prefer documentaries compared to dramatizations that, Hollywood created. And of course, like The Act. Yes, they had some things that, was factual, but there was a lot of also things that were fill-ins. So I get people that still to this day are like, I'm so sorry, you lost your hamsters. And I'm like, I never had hamsters. I had cats. But come to find out, Joey King is allergic, I think, to cats. So they had to substitute with hamsters. I'm not sure. But I was my first documentary was Erin Lee Carr's HBO Mommy Dead and Dearest. And that was already being filmed when I took my plea deal. So it was kind of like everybody had done their interview. My parents did their interview. It was already being made as I was going through my trial, or not trial, but court proceedings. All that was left was for me to speak. So on the day that I got sentenced, I gave my interview to that. And I never got to watch it until I was released. Because we didn't have HBO in prison. So
have you watched it? Have you watched it now?
I have, and I cried. There was a part where I hugged my dad, and I'm like, Daddy, I don't want to go, because I was being sent to prison, and I was just like bawling. But watching that documentary, that's the documentary that started it all. Before any of these other ones, that one was the first one, and I became well known. But it wasn't until The Act came out that it threw me into this category that I don't particularly like the term celebrity, because I don't think of myself as that. Especially when you kind of trace back, what are you infamous for? I don't like that. It's uncomfortable for me. But it did spin me into a category of well-known in the public eye. And I was getting so many messages on my tablet in prison, hundreds and hundreds a day. And I feel like I became a character in a TV show. It was no longer, the documentary had a foundation where it was, okay, let's tell this girl's story. But then the TV show turned me into a TV character. And that was hard to be seen as someone like, so much about my life. I don't know you. You're a complete stranger, but you know everything about my life. And then I went on to do documentaries.
And can I just ask about The Act? Did the producers or the actors or anyone, did they consult with you? Were you involved in that project at all?
Not at all. Not at all. I was in no way attached to that project at all.
Yeah, and I that has been my understanding, and I will say, I don't think that's ethically sound from my perspective.
I don't think it is either.
And, I've watched both. I watched the documentary made by Erin Lee Carr. She's a tremendously capable director.
Very much.
And that they interviewed Dr. Mark Feldman, who's a, close friend and colleague, and was really my entry point into talking to people in the professional sphere about this. So it felt very different to me. And, whenever I'm asked about your case, I sort of, if you're going to watch sort of one thing, sort of either watch the things that you participated in, because it did really feel as though, and I actually that was my first interview about publicly, because this was around the time that my novel came out that was based on my family situation. It was my first time talking about any of it publicly. And I did an interview with Vanity Fair about The Act and some of the other things, and was sort of talking about what I felt it got wrong about Munchausen by proxy, and also that I was very frustrated that Patricia Arquette, who plays your mom in the Act, was saying some things publicly about Munchausen by proxy that were very misleading. And, saying well, I just tried to think about when I'm worried my kids are, and I was just like, oh no, this is not like that. You're giving people the wrong idea about what this is. And It just became clear to me watching the rollout of that, these people did not bother to, and I know almost all the main experts on this now, they didn't talk to any of those people. They didn't reach out to Mark Feldman. They didn't reach out to Bjork or Mary Sanders, or, they just did zero due diligence. And it's like, here, there is this moment of maximum visibility for this abuse. And again, it's not fair to make you a monolith for that, but nonetheless, here it is. It's on this big stage. They had this huge opportunity because that was a huge hit for Hulu. That was the most popular show that had been on Hulu at the time. And I was like, they're doing press about this. Patricia Arquette's doing it. Joey King's doing it. The producers are doing it. They have this unprecedented opportunity to just say something real and smart about Munchausen by proxy, and they absolutely did not. And
missed the mark on that for sure.
Absolutely missed the mark. And then I also, when I found out that you were not involved, not compensated, that's not like, just to say to all of my true crime fellow creators, and we make decisions about, there have been instances where we have told details about someone's story and they weren't involved. That is one of the most difficult ethical dilemmas we have on the show. And the only reasons we've gone forward with it was because we felt like it was important to protect the children in that situation. And otherwise, I wouldn't do it. And there was no such there's no such argument for the act, right? That was just taking the most sensational sort of version of that story, dramatizing it for entertainment purposes and money, right? And none of which went back to you, to any survivors. Like, there might have been a net benefit, again, just like from awareness about Munchausen by proxy existing, but there was no intentionality from the creators of the act to do anything more with it than tell a story.
No, not at all. I will say that I want to say maybe it was 2 years later after the act was created. One of the producers, I don't remember which one because it has been some time, but he understood that I was done really wrong. And he did, again, this was not compensation for the show. It was his own money that he set in a trust fund for me because he acknowledged how wrong it was. And he told me, he's like, I can't speak on the logistics of it, but I can tell you this is from my heart. This is what I want to do. This is for you. And I told him, thank you so much. And that was that. So that was very kind of him.
Yeah, I think we can recognize that as an individually ethical choice to right a wrong that, probably wasn't entirely his call, but it sounds like that to me speaks to a recognition of why that production was not ethical to begin with.
Right.
Yeah. And then so you've had some projects sort of starting, filming when you were sort of towards the end of your prison sentence, and then with this Lifetime series that kind of followed you. So yeah, I mean, what's your experience of that been like, and why did you decide that this was the sort of the next move was reality television for you getting out?
Yeah, it wasn't something that I was expecting necessarily, because I had did the Prison Confessions of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and it was our Lifetime documentary. We finished that, but there was the option for the network to kind of pick up more episodes post prison. And so we just kind of went on with it. So it was like a continuation on the original Prison Confessions. And then it became its own second season and stuff like this. So it kind of was a docu-follow, and it was wonderful to film. We had a great cast, crew, producers. Everybody was so lovely to work with. And it was something that showcased that it was like a time capsule of what I was going through post-prison.
Yeah. And, watching that, I'm so glad to hear that you had a good experience with the producers and the production, because I think that makes all the difference, right? And and people's intentions and how they want to present the story. You have, I think, being on the production side, you recognize that you have a lot of power over how that person's story is presented. So I'm glad you felt like they used that well and that it served you well. And I think it seemed very clear to me why it would be important for you after all of that, after the act and all of that kind of thing, to tell your story in your own words and really wrest some control over the narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. It was nice to be able to just kind of show the good and the bad of me. It's kind of I made some good choices. I made some achievements. it showcased, unfortunately, me going through my divorce and things like that. But that's all real stuff. It's like my life is no longer about prison and, necessarily the trauma of my past. It's kind of like everything that I'm going through on a daily basis is my current life. And so I wanted the opportunity to show people like, okay, this is me, who I am today. Love me, hate me. These are my choices. They might not always be right, but they're real.
I wanted to just kind of pivot back and ask a couple of questions about your mom and kind of some of the misperceptions that I think are really will really probably resonate with a lot of fellow survivors. So you've said in interviews that it's important to you that people don't see or characterize your mother as a monster, and
Right.
that's something that really resonates with me. So how should we see people like your mom? What's a better framing?
I think a better framing, and keep in mind that I do go through lots of emotions and I have mixed emotions about this topic on a daily. So one day I could say I don't feel like we should categorize her that way, and the other day I'm still healing. So I'm like, she was terrible, and I talk a lot of crap. But at the end of the day, I think, taking my emotions out of it and just working on facts alone, I think that, my mom grew up in a time where mental health was not talked about. It was not addressed. Things, whenever it comes to your emotions and your mental health, was just swept under the rug. So I think it's so vastly important for people to recognize that individuals like this are normally people with low self esteem. And I feel like, given support and therapy and the acknowledgement that this is an issue that they have, it could be addressed and possibly treated. I feel like they're not monsters. And I asked you this question, last year whenever we got to have our chat. I asked you because it was a question that plagued me for so long. Was my mother aware that what she was doing was wrong? And you told me that yes, she was aware. And of course, I went through my own emotions after that call, but that is something that is hard for survivors. It's a hard pill to swallow. And it's something that, no, we can't sweep under the rug that they are, they are aware of it, but maybe you can correct me. Is it something that they cannot control? And then therefore therapy needs to be the intervention? Because I think that, these people are humans, whether their actions are wrong or right, or justified, not justified. They are humans, and they are someone's loved one. They are someone's mother, they're someone's father, they're someone's caregiver, they're someone to someone. And I know that sounds rich coming from me, but it's it's just part of it.
I mean, it's extremely complex, and what you're expressing, those are feelings I've gone through about my own sister. I asked that question of Dr. Mark Feldman when I first met him. Does she know? Do people who do this understand what they're doing? Because I think it's a much more comforting idea to think, oh, no, they really believe their kid's sick, or they're, they're confused, or they're having this sort of mental health issue that makes them sort of not culpable for their behavior, right? Because it's really horrible to think about someone doing this in a calculated, premeditated way. And but that is the reality. And I think it's like we can still face that reality and preserve the humanity of everyone involved. And I think that's important, because I think when we make monsters out of perpetrators of crimes, we're holding it at a distance, right? Like as watchers, we're saying, well, that would never happen to anyone I know. That would never happen in my family. That would never happen in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
That would never be a mom that's on my PTA. And the reality of what we know about this abuse now is that it absolutely could be, your family member, your in your situation, your mom did have a history of abuse and came from, I think, as you've really revealed, a family of some pretty significant dysfunction in her own right. Mm-hmm. My sister didn't. Hope Ybarra didn't. There's some perpetrators that come from abusive backgrounds. There's some that don't. It isn't this sort of like cyclical thing that it is in some other forms of abuse. And so, I think it's important to grapple with it. And I think there are these pieces that really we have to kind of tease out when we're talking about it's not a single intervention. There's the question of like, can this person be treated? And I know you're going to have a conversation with Dr. Marie Sanders, who's a dear friend. Mm-hmm. And I think we were talking about also setting you up with Dr. Kathy Ayub to maybe have a conversation for this show, which I think would be really helpful to you. But, it's like treatment is very, very challenging with this, very challenging. The reality is there's going to be a very small number of perpetrators who are going to acknowledge their behavior, and that's the first step for treatment. So there is a treatment model. Mm-hmm. There are steps they can take, but it's a lifelong recovery process. It's, and it's unlikely. I think we can assume that, like, yes, we should look at treatment. We should always hold that space. And we have to be kind of realistic about that. And then I think there's the totally separate question of, is this a person who is safe around children? And mm-hmm. you can still preserve someone's humanity and say, but okay, you've crossed some lines here where we're not going to take chances leaving children alone in your care. And I wanted to ask you, because this is a question I think that it's really important to me to ask any survivor. Like, dealing with child abuse is quite complicated as a society, right? When is it better to remove the child from that situation? When do we give someone a second chance? What interventions do we use? Just speaking for you, not on behalf of all Munchausen, by proxy survivors everywhere, what do you wish had happened in your situation?
I wish that my mom would have been caught early on, because if there could have been something that she got caught, a lie, something, I could have been removed from her care and put in the care of my dad. And that would have avoided so much, because, a lot of people, maybe not the, the true supporters and the people in our community, but there are the naysayers that don't even acknowledge me as a survivor because they feel that I was diagnosed with microdeletion 1q21.1, and they sort of say, well, you were sick. You were a sick child. Therefore, she didn't have Munchausen by proxy. Or she was never formally diagnosed with Munchausen by proxy. So how are we labeling it that? And maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
I can. And that's something that we talked about a little bit when we talked for your show. That's a really common misperception / bad faith argument, depending on who's making it. Because there are people who are very invested in the idea that this just isn't a real form of abuse. And so that is an argument that they use. So number one, there is it's a complete false argument that if a child has a real health condition, that means that is sort of exculpatory, right? That means abuse is not happening. Of course, abuse can happen if a person has a real thing, because Munchausen by proxy abuse encompasses exaggerating, inducing, and fabricating, illnesses in a child. And so I don't know anything about your genetic condition that you do have, but I would guess that quite a lot of the interventions that your mom, applied had nothing to do with your condition. And so it doesn't mean that they can't make it worse, and we know, and also, so there's that, and that comes up a lot, right? Like, a lot of perpetrators will say, well, I got this diagnosis from a doctor. Well, okay, but
Right.
if you got that diagnosis from a doctor and you use deception to do it, well, then that's abuse. And even if that diagnosis is real, if you were making the condition worse, if you were lying to doctors about symptoms, if you were pushing for unnecessary interventions, those things are all still abuse. So abuse can absolutely still happen with a child that has a real condition. And that's just a complete misunderstanding of this abuse to say that it can't. And as to the second thing of being formally, diagnosed, yeah, your mom was not criminally convicted and she's not formally diagnosed. There is still evidence of abuse because of your experience, because of what doctors have reported, because of what's in your medical records. And that is actually typically how, and I'm curious to know about how your process of how you were able to put a name to it. But that is, I think, again, a misunderstanding of Munchausen by proxy being primarily this diagnosis, the psychiatric diagnosis of factitious disorder imposed on another. It is in the DSM, but it's abuse, it's a crime, and there either is evidence of that crime or there is not evidence of that crime. And in your case, there is evidence of the crime of your mother's abuse, and therefore there is no legitimate question of whether or not you suffered abuse. And anyone who's saying that there is at this point, as your story has been well explored, and Mark Feldman obviously participated in the documentary. He's as unassailable of an expert as there is. There is no legitimate question about that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to know, obviously, while you were in the situation, you understood that something was wrong, something bad was happening. When did you first discover that this was a thing called Munchausen by proxy? What was that sort of process of revelation for you?
What's so interesting is when I was living in the abuse, I didn't even know that it was abuse. I thought my mom's weird, my mom's overbearing, controlling. It's like I didn't have the language to articulate what I was going through. And there were people that I reached out to. Everybody was like, well, why didn't you tell someone? Why didn't you ask for help? It was that I was saying things like, don't tell my mom this, but I'm telling you this, or my mom's a little controlling. She's a helicopter mom. But I didn't have the language to articulate, I'm being abused. This is what's going on.
So you were just talking about how one of the things people have said to you is sort of like, why didn't you speak up? Which, by the way, is an unfair expectation to put on any child that's being abused or any young person that's in an abuse situation, especially one as complicated as Munchausen by proxy. So you were saying that you were making comments sometimes to people in your life, and there were obviously signs. There were obviously red flags for what was happening to you. And I have to believe that if your dad in particular understood what Munchausen by proxy looked like, if the doctors who were treating you, which we'll talk about in a moment, had maybe better understood what Munchausen by proxy was, there might have been some more intervention, but that should never be put on the person who's being victimized, especially because how intense the psychological manipulation is. Victims in the midst of this are often not going to have that framing. And so we can't expect victims to be like, hey, I'm being victimized in this specific way. Here is the intervention. Please execute it on my behalf.
Right, exactly. And so it's like my father, he didn't understand what Munchausen by proxy was before all this happened. Obviously to some degree, I think my mother did. But as for myself, I didn't understand. I never heard of Munchausen by proxy before. It was not something that I ever read about, heard about, watched a TV show about. So it wasn't until after being arrested that, I'm sitting there having an attorney visit with my public defender, and I'm just, telling him all of this stuff, still in my frame of reference of not having the language to explain what I was going through. But he was able to get a lot of what was going on from medical records. I mean, the first thing that flagged it is I could walk.
Right.
It's like it's not like he had to dig and try to find this out. It was pretty easy by just looking at the fact that I could walk, and then kind of like where she could walk. So how is this happening? Because she's supposedly paralyzed. So
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, yours is a case where, and it's not always this obvious. Yours is a case that was pretty obvious. I think that's almost like the classic thing, right? Of like, a couple things that came up in your case, right? The sort of like, oh, they have these alleged issues with eating that are not real. They're in a wheelchair and they can't move except that they can. And, I think the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because you were technically chronologically an adult when those events took place, there is kind of there are these sort of like two points where interventions could have happened to prevent the worst possible outcome. And one of them is when you're a child, right? And then you're talking about child welfare and an intervention that involves custody and that kind of thing. And obviously, in your case, that didn't happen. And I'm so sorry that didn't happen. You deserved better. You didn't deserve to be left in that situation. And then there's this other period where you're an adult, but obviously part of your story is that you were deceived about your actual age, and deceived about your abilities to live an independent life. And that's a very common part of this dynamic, is that I've seen many, teenagers, young adults, their parent will try everything to keep them under their control, under their roof. They will convince them that they will never be able to live an adult life. That's an extremely common part of this story. And so I think that's another thing that people are really not aware of, is that you are not out of the woods once you are, physically grown.
right.
And so, you had a couple of attempts to leave before you got together with Nick and all of that. So can you give us some insight on, that piece of the experience? And, you talked about what you wish someone had done when you were a child. What about during that period? What would have helped you get safely out of that situation once you were no longer a child?
Absolutely. That's a question that, and that's a weight that I put on myself, is that, when I was a child, it's kind of like, okay, I'm helpless. There's very little that I can do. And then once I became an adult, the power dynamic sort of shifts, and the blame sort of shifts, I guess, even on my own shoulders. It's kind of like a coulda, shoulda, woulda thing. And so, yes, there were many times that I probably could have ran away. I did attempt twice, failed attempts. There were times that I could have called the police, but was too afraid to. But at the end of the day, I do feel like, even though I was an adult, I was working with a maturity level that was not up to date with my chronological age. So, yes, I was 24 when I got arrested, but mentally and emotionally, my development was stunted. So, I could have been, a teenager in that mind frame, because of zero life experience. Most people mature and grow with what? Life experience. So if you don't have that as your foundation, you're not working up to date with your age, I guess. And you don't think about these alternatives. And so for me, I just kind of wish that I would have had the language to say, hey, I think my mom has Munchausen by proxy. I wish I would have heard of it back then, so I could have told someone. But again, it's kind of like hindsight's 2020, and I can't go back now. So it's just,
Yeah. No, and I don't think it's, the purpose of sort of asking you about that is not about your personal regrets or what have you. I mean, I think it's really healthy that you take accountability for your actions. I think that's appropriate. And I think that framing for people and their understanding of this story is really important, because I think if people are projecting what they themselves might have been like at 24, right? Like when I was 24, I was in my, first job in New York City after graduating college when I was 22 and had, all kinds of like healthy support systems and was encouraged to be independent by my parents and had all kinds of experiences with peers that develop, it's like just like all of those things are purposefully kept from Munchausen by proxy survivors in the vast majority of in many cases, especially like sort of the cases on the extreme ends. They're not in school. They're not allowed to have relationships with peers. They're not allowed to have romantic relationships and develop all of those things and try things and fail and develop a sense of independence. And they're often told, which I believe you were in your case, you'll never live an independent life. You'll always need me and you're going to die young. And so that's like they create a very purposeful terror of the outside world. So the expectation that you could just leave, I think, is just an absolute misunderstanding of the situation. And I don't know. I would love to think that the police would have given you some helpful resources. Truthfully, I don't know, because there are plenty of police that don't even understand that this is a crime when it involves a small child. So having an adult call them and say, I'm in this situation, I don't know.
That could have been intervention, such as, my mother claimed that I was homeschooled. And as a small child, yes, she did homeschool me for a small time. But then she became, got to the point where she didn't want to anymore. And there was she was telling the doctors in the hospital, oh, she's homeschooled. Her homeschool, we call it Angel Heart Academy, and give them that information. But it was never registered with an actual school district. And it was never followed up with. And so that was something that I fell through the cracks with. So it's kind of like, yes, the school districts could have helped had I've been, aligned with that, with real homeschooling or something. And then there's just other avenues and other things that could have been those points in which intervention could have happened. And it's just like falling through the cracks of every single one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's deliberate, right? I mean, that isolation is deliberate. And the homeschooling thing comes up in so many, not just Munchausen by proxy cases, but other abuse situations where, and of course, there are many, homeschool families and homeschool parents that are not abusive. But unfortunately, it creates for opportunistic abusers, it creates a situation where you don't have the child exposed to the outside world and, importantly, mandatory reporters of abuse, right? And a lot of reports about Munchausen by proxy come from schools because those teachers and school nurses and administrators are, if the child is in school, they're very aware of the child being taken out of school for long periods of time, and they're observing the child for longer periods during the day. My oldest is in school. She's at school all day long, right? If I was telling the school, oh, she has this seizure disorder and she has all these things and all of these problems, and then they're observing her being a normal child during the day, they're going to have an inkling that something is up. So that is, I think, a part of the reason why they keep them out of school, right? They don't want other eyes on the child. And I think like eyes on the child is always healthy for the child. I don't think there's any argument for a child being isolated at home with one parent. Right. Even in situations where, children have profound disabilities, what we hear from those parents, and we have, a fair number of parents of disabled kids that listen to the show. So I've, talked to them and heard their feedback is that they really try so hard to have their children have normal experience, quote, sort of normal experiences, or just like interactions with their peers, have as much of a life outside of their medical situations as possible. And so like, there's just no scenario, I think, where having a child be isolated that profoundly could ever be good for a child.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. And so, you were in a situation, which is, again, very common, where doctors clearly suspected abuse. The doctors who spoke in the documentary describe this, one of them, I believe, describes seeing you walk and that you were in a wheelchair. And I think for those of us that are knowledgeable about abuse, just absolutely tearing our hair out at that comment, because you understand that this doctor is breaching their ethics and honestly breaking mandatory reporting laws, because I just think, sir, you're describing a massive red flag for abuse and you did not report it. And,
Right.
We've covered situations on this show, a couple of them, where children died because of doctors' failure to report abuse that they suspected, that they knew about, that they described very accurately, like what you are describing as abuse, and you are describing a situation where you did not report it. I'd imagine that's really a hard thing for you to reflect on. And actually, you talked in an interview about that you at some point were considering legal action against some of those doctors.
I was. And the only reason why I haven't is, I was in prison for 8.5 years after all of this, sort of happened. And so in the time that I was in prison, a lot of people are like, well, you could have had all the time in the world to build your case up, but it's like I didn't have access to the internet to try to find lawyers and do all this sort of outreach and all this kind of stuff. It wasn't accessible to the fullest ability at that time. And then once I got out, it's like with everything, with the media and the documentaries, writing my book, then getting pregnant and my pregnancy, it's like life was just way too much to take on now another court case. So it's like, yes, now that I am starting to kind of settle into a calmer life, I can reconsider that avenue and see, number one, statute of limitations. What are the statute of limitations? If they have expired, then that time is up. There's nothing I can really do, right?
Thank you so much for listening to the first part of my conversation with Gypsy. And hey, there's much more to come. So we'll be back next week with part 2. Nobody Should Believe Me is produced and hosted by me, Andrea Dunlop. Our editor is Greta Stromquist, and our senior producer is Mariah Gossett. Administrative support from Nola Carmouche.